So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I warmly welcome everybody here on board and also online who were able to join us on this very special day. Thank you very much for coming here and paying attention to our professor, Sir Partha Dasgupta, who has joined us today for this conference. My name is Brigitta Pulai, and I'll be the host of this conference today. I'm the deputy head of the Research Institute for the Integrity of Creation and one of the main organizers of this series of conferences. Just a few words let me speak about why we are here today and how come that at a Christian university we are dealing with issues such as the Dasgupta Review. Our research institute was funded at the end of 2021, the very year when the Dasgupta Review was published. And ever since the beginning, it was our strong intention to make this very important paper available for a wider range of people, because we really believe that what is stated in this paper concerning the direction of evolution of economics, how we should be seeing wealth, and what is the purpose of economy is really important, and we find it extremely important because this is something which refers very much to the teachings of the Catholic Church. So this is a crossroad for science and belief, and therefore we think it's really important to spread the word. So let me start with asking our dear Father Rector, Géza Kuminec, to make his opening speech. Please, Rektor úr, öné a szó.
Hát én sajnos angolul nem tudok, úgyhogy kénytelen vagyok ezt most ma magyarul mondani. Tisztelt Dasgupta professzor úr, tisztelt hölgyeim és uraim, kedves kollégák! Nagy örömmel köszöntöm Önöket a biodiverzitás közgazdaságtana, a Dasgupta-jelentés című könyv magyar nyelvű kiadásának alkalmából rendezett konferencián. Külön megtiszteltetés számunkra, hogy köreinkben üdvözölhetjük Sir Partha Dasguptát, a Cambridge-i Egyetem emeritus professzorát, a jelentés főszerzőjét. Isten hozta, professzor úr! Egyetemünk kiemelt feladatának tartja, hogy a Teremtésvédelmi Kutatóintézet munkájának keretében többek között olyan tudományos műveket, kutatási eredményeket tegyen elérhetővé a magyar közönség számára, amelyek nem csak a szellemet, de a lelket is építik. A Pázmány Péter Katolikus Egyetem rektoraként különös jelentőséget tulajdonítok ennek a tudományos műnek, mely túlmutat a megszokott kereteken és erkölcsi üzenetével is hatni kíván a világra. A jelentés üzenetei közül pedig hadd emeljek ki 3, amelyeket meghatározónak tartok, és amelyek teljes mértékben egybecsengenek a katolikus egyház által képviselt tanításokkal is. Ezek a természet önértéke, a közjó és a gazdaság szolgáló szerepe. A Dasgupta jelentés világosan mutat rá arra, amit Ferenc pápa Laudato Si enciklikája is hangsúlyoz. A teremtett világ védelme nem csupán ökológiai, hanem mélyen spirituális és erkölcsi kötelességünk is. Hiszen ez közös otthonunk, amelyet Istentől kaptunk, és amelynek gondnokai vagyunk. A professzor úr tudományos munkájában hasonló megfogalmazást tesz, csak a gazdaság nyelvén, amikor azt mondja, hogy a természet eszközszerű kezelése gazdasági és erkölcsi csődbe viszi világunkat. Amennyiben gazdasági modelljeink nem veszik figyelembe a természetben rejlő korlátokat és értékeket, egyházunkban ez a gondolat mindig is jelen volt, és többek között Szent II. János pápa is foglalkozott vele a Sollicitudo Rei Socialis körlevelében gyönyörűen fogalmazza meg a problémát, amikor írja, idézem: a természetes környezetben az ember már nem lát egyebet, mint a közvetlen felhasználás és a fogyasztás számára hasznos dolgot. A teremtő azonban úgy akarta, hogy az ember közösségben éljen a természettel, mint értelmes és nemes ura, mint őrzője, s nem mint garázda birtokosa, aki mindent kiárusít, s mindenre tekintet nélkül pusztítja a természetet. Eddig az idézet. Az egyház társadalmi tanítása és a jelentés közös üzenetének egy másik fontos pontja a természet önértékének az elismerése. Napjainkban szinte már közhelynek számít, hogy mindennek van ára. De ez egyben sajnos azt is jelenti, hogy a ma uralkodó gazdasági rendszer csak azt ismeri el fontosnak és hasznosnak, aminek ára van, amiből pénzt lehet csinálni. Bár az elmúlt évtizedben sorra születtek azok a kutatási eredmények, amelyek a természetnek az emberi egészségre gyakorolt pozitív hatását bizonyították, ezek még mindig csak a természet egy tulajdonképpen ökológiai szolgáltatásának tekinthető aspektusára irányították a figyelmet. A mai uralkodó antropocentrikus világképben önértéke csak az embernek van, és másodlagos értéke azon dolgoknak lehet, amelyek az ember számára hasznosak. Ferenc pápa a Laudato Si enciklikában ugyanakkor felhívja a figyelmet arra, hogy a teremtés nem csupán az ember túlélése érdekében fontos, hanem önálló értéke van. Ez az önérték a tudósok, a művészek és a hívők számára egyaránt nyilvánvaló, akik csodálattal tekintenek a természet szépségére és rendjére. A pápa hangsúlyozza, hogy a teremtett világ szépsége és rendje Isten művének kifejeződése, és mint ilyen tiszteletet és védelmet érdemel. Nem csupán esztétikai élményt nyújt, hanem mélyebb vallási jelentősége is van, hiszen a teremtett világ része annak a végső célkitűzésnek, amelyben a teremtés és az ember közösen részesednek Isten örömében és dicsőségében. A másik számomra jelentős közös pont a közjó megjelenése. A közjó a katolikus egyház egyik társadalmi tanításának egyik központi gondolata, mely már az 1965-ös második vatikáni zsinat által írt, hirdetett Gaudium et Spes kezdetű lelkipásztori konstitúcióban is egyfajta megfogalmazásra került. Idézem: a közjó azoknak a társadalmi életfeltételeknek az összessége, amelyek mind a csoportoknak, mind az egyes tagoknak lehetővé teszik, hogy teljesebben és könnyebben elérjék tökéletességüket. Minden csoportnak számot kell vetnie a többi csoport szükségleteivel és jogos igényeivel, sőt az egész emberi család közjavával is. Eddig az idézet. De hasonlóan fogalmazta Szent II. János Pál pápa is 2005. január 1-én a Béke Világnapjára írt üzenetében is, miszerint a közjó a teremtmények kiteljesedésére irányuló életfeltételek összessége, mely az ember felelős művelésével és megőrzésével valósul meg. Ez a gondolat közigazdasági megközelítésben professzor úrnál is megjelenik, amikor a javakhoz való igazságos hozzáférésről, a kizsákmányolás elutasításáról vagy a közösségi felelősségvállalásról ír. A természetes tőke olyan globális közjóként való leírása, amelyet közösen használunk, így a védelme is közös felelősségünk, szintén egy olyan gondolat, mely rezonál a katolikus tanításra. S végül még egy közös gondolatot engedjenek meg, hogy kiemeljek. Ez pedig a gazdaság szerepe és kapcsolata az emberrel, mert ez a mai gazdasági rendszer neuralgikus pontja. A közgazdaságtan modernkori filozófiai hátterét leginkább az utilitarizmussal lehet definiálni. Korunk egyik legmarkánsabb jellemzője, hogy a gazdasági gondolkodásmód, a haszon-profit kontextusban való értékítélet mindent átsző. Ez alól a természet sem jelent kivételt. A környezeti válság egyik oka az is, hogy a haszonmaximálás elvét követik itt is. Sőt, az ember is mintegy eszközzé válik a profit oltárán, eszközzé áldozattá válik a profit oltárán, és az ember van a gazdaságért, nem pedig a gazdaság az emberért. A gyakorlattal szemben ugyanakkor a gazdaság emberközpontúságának követelményét az egyház szociális tanításának dokumentumai kifejezetten tartalmazzák. Itt a társadalmi tanítás kompendiumára, a Laborem Exercentis és a Centesimus Annus enciklikára gondolhatunk. Lényegüket tekintve azt tanítják, hogy a gazdaság végső feladata a közjó előmozdítása, és elítélik a gazdasági rendszerek olyan működését, amelyek emberi szenvedést vagy kizsákmányolást eredményeznek. Ferenc pápának ez a Gazdaság öl című könyve elutasítja a fennálló gazdasági modellt, mely figyelmen kívül hagyja az emberi méltóságot és a közjó előmozdítását. A gazdaságnak a profit és a növekedés hajszolása helyett az emberek és közösségek érdekeit kellene előtérbe helyeznie. A pápa hangsúlyozta, hogy a gazdaság nem lehet cél önmagában, hanem eszköz kell, hogy legyen az emberek szolgálatában. Ferenc pápa gyakran bírálta a szabadpiac eszméjét is, amely szerinte valójában nem biztosít valódi szabadságot, hiszen a gazdasági szabadság nem kerülhet az emberi jogok és szabadságok fölé. A piac nem lehet abszolút érték, hanem tiszteletben kell tartania az igazságosság követelményeit. Ehhez kapcsolódó gondolat a fejlődés fogalmának újra definiálása is, amennyiben a fejlődést a vagyon mennyiségének növekedésével tekintjük azonosnak, és amely megközelítés a jelenkori mérőszámok struktúrájában is tetten érhető. Ezzel kapcsolatban már a Sollicitudo Rei Socialisban 1987-ben úgy fogalmazott Szent II. János Pál pápa, hogy, idézem, felül kell vizsgálnunk a fejlődés fogalmát, amely biztosan nem egyezik azzal, hogy az anyagi szükségleteket kielégítsük a javak növekvő kínálatával, tekintet nélkül az emberek túlnyomó részének szenvedésére, és amelynek az egyesek vagy az egész nemzetek önzése a kizárólagos irányító szempontja. Az igazi fejlődés erkölcsi természetű. Elő kell, hogy mozdítsa valamennyi emberi jog betartását és valamennyi nép teljes tiszteletét. Eddig az idézet. Sőt, tovább megy az enciklika, hiszen a modernkori bűnök közé sorolja a hataloméhséget és a kapzsiságot, ami a fogyasztói társadalmat és a profitéhes gazdaságokat jellemzik. Idézem ismét. A fejlődés legfőbb akadálya a profitéhség és a hatalomvágy. A bűnnek ezt a struktúráját csak ellentétes magatartással győzhetjük le, nevezetesen a személyek, illetve a nemzetek közötti szolidaritással. A jelentés ebben is egy irányba mutat a katolikus tanítással, amennyiben egy új természetközpontú gazdasági szemléletet sürget, ahol a gazdaság nem növekedéscentrikus, hanem az ember és a természet közti egyensúlyt keresi. Ez az új szemlélet bírálja a GDP-t, mint jóléti mutatót, mely a természeti tőke és a pénzben nem kifejezhető értékek ignorálása, mint a természet önértéke miatt torz képet ad a gazdasági valóságról, és ezáltal tévútra vezeti a fejlődést. De nem szeretnék ennél jobban belemenni a részletekbe, ezt Dasgupta professzor úr majd minden bizonnyal nálam sokkal kompetensebb módon megteszi helyettem. Én megelégszem azzal, hogy még egyszer kifejezzem örömemet afelett, hogy Sir Partha Dasguptát vendégül láthatjuk egyetemünkön, és személyesen is meghallgathatjuk építő gondolatait. Köszönöm mindazok munkáját, akik részt vettek a fordításban, a kiadásban, és abban, hogy ez a gondolatébresztő megjelenhetett magyarul is. Fontos lépés ez az oktatás, a közgondolkodás és a döntéshozatal formálásában egyaránt. Bízom benne, hogy a Dasgupta-jelentés nem csak elemzésként, hanem lelkiismeretünk megszólítójaként is szolgál majd. Egyetemünk elkötelezett abban, hogy a szellemiség mentén nevelje hallgatóit a teremtett világ iránti felelős szeretetre, és eljuttassa ezeket az üzeneteket a társadalom minél szélesebb rétegeihez is. Köszönöm megtisztelő figyelmüket, és kívánom, hogy ez a kiadás sokak gondolkodását és cselekvését formálja a közjó érdekében.
Nagyon szépen köszönjük, rektor atya, kedves szavait és a megnyitó beszédét. Thank you very much for your opening speech. And now, let me introduce you our main guest, Sir Partha Dasgupta, and to give you some very brief introduction about him. So Sir Partha Dasgupta is a Frank Ramsey Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Cambridge. He is a Fellow of the British Academy of the Royal Society, member of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, the US National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Art and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, and the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. His book, The Economics of Biodiversity, the Dasgupta Review, commissioned by the UK Treasury, presents a comprehensive economic framework for biodiversity and calls for urgent and transformative change in how we think and act and measure economic success to protect and enhance our prosperity and the natural world. So now let me ask the professor to please deliver your speech and tell us more in details about your review and how we should be thinking about this issue. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, Reverend Rector, hosting this occasion. It's an honor, and I have much to learn from a particular perspective that you have, and my own perspective as an economist. I want to emphasize that I'm a card-carrying economist. I'm not. But economics is a language, and how we put the language to use, of course, matters and differs from economist to economist. My own take on economics is that it is absolutely fundamental, because it alerts us to the fact that choices almost invariably involve trade-offs. If you want this, you can't have that. If you want that, you can't have this. If you want more of this, you'll have to have less of that. These structuring of what is feasible, what is possible, is what I think economics is about. On the other hand, pure description of possibilities is not enough, because even the description requires has an evaluative content hidden there, in that how you choose to describe something already presupposes your reading of the world around you. So I don't want to make a big distinction between the descriptive and evaluative aspects of any form of analysis. They are different, but they're so interconnected that it's best not to try and keep them apart. There is a strain of economics which I don't believe was intended by our profession. certainly if you read Adam Smith, you don't get that sense of seeing interchanges, human interchanges, in terms of market transactions. There's nothing intrinsic in my discipline which says so. On the other hand, as I was growing up as an economist, the 1970s, 80s, 90s, that became increasingly the way the subject is read by close friends of mine, actually, but usually across the Atlantic, on the other side of the Atlantic. And because I have very close friends on that side as well, the fact that I didn't see economics that way didn't risk our friendships, as it were. But I have always been not only doubtful of that viewpoint, but dismissive of that viewpoint. It's a language, and how we choose to language, in some sense, reflects the values we have. Markets are but one set of institutions, formal markets in particular. There are many, many other kinds of exchanges that take place, starting, for example, inside the household, inside the family. There are exchanges taking place between brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers, and so forth. We don't usually call them exchanges, but sometimes we do. I did this for you yesterday. You owe me some labor time or something. But you get the sense, you understand. So my own education has been to lift economics out of the sense of using the markets as the fundamental institution, and looking wider into human interchanges. And there I found the best work, the most illuminating work, came from anthropologists, because they have been studying, at least the ones I've read, were studying relationships which may be seen as markets, but maybe through interchanges in long-term relationships. And long-term relationships have a very interesting way it's an interesting way of looking at, starting with human relationships, and because you can condition actions on promises of the future and expectations about the future and linking it. And I think I've written quite a bit on that. It's sometimes seen as part of the idea of social capital. I don't know if that expression is familiar to you, but it sort of sums up a kind of often implicit relationships and commitments, promises, and so forth. And I came to the environmental side of things, natural capital side of things, from social capital. It was just a reverse, because I found I was interested in understanding, at least in the 1970s, I was interested in understanding exchanges that take place in villages in my part of the world, Bengal. There, at least my sense was, certainly when I was growing up, that wasn't in Bengal, it was more in UP, in Uttar Pradesh, Benares. I found that the relationships looked very different from the ones that I was led to study later on. And the centrality of natural capital began to loom large in my mind. And here is why. At least now I'm going to gallop into later years and see how I could see the human economy. The way the economies are described today are in terms of the final products. We think in terms of GDP, per capita GDP, and life expectancy, extremely important indicator of the quality of life in a society, and poverty measures, and so forth. But these are the features of a society that emerge out of interactions. And in the last the key, and as I now read it, the key period which has influenced so much of our thinking today is the post-war period. It's been an astonishing change that has taken place globally. I'm talking about the global economy. I'm averaging over everything, okay? I mean, obviously there's huge inequalities and so forth, but for my purposes here, I want to stick to the global economy and talking about the average person. If you look at let me just see, the statistics and the curves, 1950, to just using that as a marker, was a turning point of a kind which the global economy has never witnessed. In 75 years, the global economy has shot up in a furious way. Global GDP has increased more than 15-fold. Per capita global GDP increased more than 5-fold, despite the fact that population grew from 2.5 billion to 8 billion. This is from 1950 to 2020. Life expectancy at birth has increased from 46 to 72 years, and the proportion of people in extreme poverty has declined from more than 60% to less than 10%. So if I were to, how do I move this? Yes, I got it. However, let me just, sorry, let me get back to yeah. These statistics reflect a rare contact between economics and the earth sciences. For our earth scientists have independently dubbed 1950 as being the year we entered the Anthropocene. They were looking at the consequences or the features of the Earth system that are accompanied by the great improvement in the standard of living, GDP growth, and life expectancy, the statistics that I was mentioning in the previous slide. And they found that, yes, again, there are the signatures on the Earth system, on ecosystems, are visible, striking, and they really sharply increased from 1950 onwards. So we have two pictures in front of us. One of great success in the conditions of life for the average person, and on the other, an incredible increase in the strain that has been put onto the Earth system. Now, I don't know of any occasion in the past before this literature developed over the past 5-10 years, where there was a serious contact between economics and the earth sciences. This one is a clear one, where two very separate disciplines with different techniques of analysis, different questions, came together to paint a very similar picture of what's going on. One looking at the success side, and the other, the implications of that success on the Earth system, and therefore its possible implications for future of the human economy. That's how I see this current discussion. That's where we are today. And we economists, as a profession, have concentrated on the former. Today these things have changed a little bit, but up to about 10 years ago, there was a plethora of books being published in English, in America and in England, on a triumphalist literature about how well the human economy has done, how well we are doing. I can quote you numbers of books which were saying, and this was happening, obviously, the economic models were saying that these improvements have taken place because of accumulation of two types of capital assets: human capital, education, health, and so forth. And these are all interrelated, of course, but you can see these stocks. Produced capital, roads, buildings, machines, and so forth. And of course, ideas, science and technology. These three were responsible, and rightly so too, giving rise to the incredible improvement. And with them came the fact that lives were better than the way I just have been describing. The flip side, of course, was the imprint of that success on the states of the Earth system. And the Earth scientists essentially study, broadly speaking, study changes that take place slowly over, if not geological time, certainly over longish periods by the human span. Whereas ecologists tend to study changes that are taking place at a faster rate on ecosystems in general. Deforestation, grasslands converted, turning into scrubland, and so forth. And my own interest grew through my interaction with ecologists. Largely, I was educated while I was at Stanford, in particular, by such people as Paul Ehrlich, and then later on Simon Levin and others. These are major ecologists, and they taught me how to think about the Earth system or ecosystems as natural systems interacting to produce output. And of course, I was more interested in the productivity of ecosystems, the goods and services they make available to us. And they were more interested in the reasons, the underlying structure which gives rise to the goods and services that we enjoy, whether it's grasslands, wetlands, coastal regions, forests, and so forth. Okay? Now, obviously, the enormous success that we've enjoyed since 1950, this extraordinary period, is reflected in the statistics has been achieved by an accumulation of produced capital, human capital, but unfortunately by the accumulation of natural capital. For example, these data come in various forms, so I'm going to give you a few to indicate how you can attack it, look at the problem from various points of view. For example, the rate of species extinction, this is something which is not often emphasized, is estimated to be 100,000 times the background rate of extinction of some 0.1 to 1 species per million per year. Background extinction rate means the last few million years, okay? Together, they suggest that some 1 million species of a total of 8 to 20 million species will be extinct in the next 100 years. Now, species extinction is not something that we hear about so much, but I want to emphasize that here, particularly in the presence of the Reverend Rector, because you can think of species outside us, insects, for example, which are in some sense the most endangered. They have a value, intrinsic value of their own, independent of whether we are here or not. In fact, they were here a long time before we ever showed up on Earth, okay? But on the other hand, we economists, I think, have a tendency, and I think it's a correct tendency, useful tendency, not to look at the intrinsic value, but to look at the instrumental value to us. Now that sounds very crass. It's something I don't believe any economist actually holds, but it's a division of labor. We look at the means, and there are many other people who look at the ends themselves. And the advantage of looking at the means is that then you don't have to get into disputes about the ends. If insects are absolutely essential for human life, we study the instrumental value of insects. And then on top of that, you can put in the intrinsic value if it is needed. So we have, the extinction that is taking place now is just phenomenal. And on the instrumental side, which is what I'm emphasizing, why should we be worried about it? One reason, and something which doesn't show up in the discussion, in the public discussions often, is what we economists call the option value of assets. You may not know that a particular species of insects are doing something very beneficial to us now. But you know that you may know in the future that they have a value. Okay? And it's this precautionary value, the fact that if you exterminate an entire species, whose value we do not know, or you think it doesn't have any value, but you have some suspicion that in 20, 30 years' time you may know that it has value, then you're foreclosing, by extinguishing it, you're foreclosing that avenue. We economists call that an option value. You keep your options open because you don't know whether they will be valuable and you have a suspicion that they may be. Okay? And the ecologist Paul Ehrlich created an incredibly interesting imagery about option values, although he didn't call it option values. He asked us to imagine traveling in an aircraft, flying in an aircraft, from which, for some reason, rivets were being removed. Now, the first rivet doesn't matter, second rivet doesn't matter, third rivet doesn't matter, and so on. But gradually, as you remove more and more rivets, or when I say you, somebody is doing it from there while you're flying, then the plane starts wobbling. And then as you keep on moving it, it wobbles more and more, and at some unknown point, it crashes. It can't take it anymore. So you have this whole range of uncertainty of the value of the components of an ecosystem, and their destruction can lead to this. I think it's a very, very telling imagery, because it tells us that even if you don't know the value of something, there's a case for preserving it, because it may have a value sometime in the future. So this extinction, the issue of extinction, seems to me to be really important, and we tend not to discuss it much in the literature. Okay, but on the other, so this is more in the micro side. On the macro side, I've tried to reconstruct economics over the past 20, 25 years. The process has been slow, largely because I'm slow at work. I take time to understand what I'm doing. Mostly I don't know why I'm doing what I'm doing. But now I've got a fairly settled understanding. And given my age, my guess is it'll remain there until I die. I mean, there's not much time left for me to revive it into anything better. And I'm writing this as a follow-up of the review, which is what has brought me here, and the translation, in a book titled on Natural Capital, The Value of the World Around Us. There's a subtitle. It'll be coming out at the end of July, and I will ensure that you receive a copy. And I'll send it through. You'll get a copy of it. It's meant to be for the general public. It's only about 220 pages long, and it's not following the review in tight detail, because the review is now 4 years old, and my own ideas have changed, or at least advanced, to the point where I think I understand things a bit better, and I've tried to do it in that form. I've taken to take that into account. So now, at the macro level, when I say at macro level, if you approach the human economy not from the insect world upwards, but from the global economy downwards and deep, then you have a global GDP, and that's output. And it's misleading to think of that as a sign of human well-being, because GDP is gross domestic product. G is the acronym for gross, and which means that you don't take depreciation into account. Now that sounds trivial, but not when it comes to natural capital. Buildings, roads, not too much of a problem, because you have an idea of at what rate they depreciate, so you keep a depreciation allowance. And you have replacement of parts, improvements, and so forth, road improvements, and so forth. That's a sort of a routine. You keep maybe 5% of your revenue for that kind of purposes, some ballpark figure for maintenance and replacement, and so forth. Natural capital is a different matter altogether, because they can absolutely disappear like that, because you just cut a forest or bifurcate a forest by creating a road, and the entire structure of the forest changes, at least locally. Even the local climate can change, the microclimate can change. And so we have a problem of significant importance there. So what I did at the macro level was to think in terms of breaking up the stocks into produced capital, human capital, and natural capital, wetlands, grasslands, mangroves, coral reefs, woodlands, forests, lakes, and such biomes of the atmospheres, the oceans, the soils and subsoil resources. Okay? Now this demarcation is pretty standard. Others have done that too. And what I've tried to do is to use this framework to look at the stocks of global capital stocks, movements in global capital stocks. Notice this, I've already made a big change from the way we assess economies. I'm looking at stocks, not flows. And that's the right thing to do in my judgment, because what we pass from one year to the other are stocks of capital. What we give to our children when we die are stocks of capital, some of which is, of course, their education. The education that we have imparted, or parental education, school education, college education, or whatever, or a whole attitude to life. Those are capital stocks, abstract, but that's what they're. They're the infrastructure in which a person begins to live. So that's what we bequeath and give to ourselves over time, stocks. So in a way, the review and my more recent work has really focused on stocks, not flows. And of course, from stocks you can talk about flow, because you ask the rate of change of stocks, that's a flow. So you say, has the stock increased? And then you'll say yes, because the output from that stock was then reinvested into the stock so that it is increased. In the case of natural capital, investment, and that's something for us to think about, because natural notion of, when we use the word investment, what do we think mentally? If we're thinking in terms of the stockbroker, okay, that's pushing paper around. You know, I'm going to sell these stocks and I'm going to buy those stocks. When you talk to your broker, if you have a broker or whatever, okay? But if you talk to a real person, I mean, you talk about real investment as opposed to paper investment, then the picture that one has is people in hard hats with drills, breaking concrete, building a huge structure, and then saying, that's investment. In the case of natural capital, the story is somewhat different. Of course, you can invest to increase the productivity of an ecosystem, but mostly the investment is simply wait. Let the system grow on its own, because the nature has a dynamics of its own. So the regeneration of nature requires waiting, and that's a cost. So it's not as though this is cheap, and that's why patience is important, how far-sighted you are. If you cut down the forest, you won't have a forest left. You may have, so the ideas of discounting and so forth are of significance. Now, I want to make one more preliminary point, if you like, before I come to the diagram here, which is an argument can be made that when it comes to assets, it's not the argument that very often people say that we are not far-sighted. we're short-sighted when it comes to investment activities, and that's why nature is in trouble. One reason nature is in trouble is, of course, they don't necessarily have a market value. So it's something like generally the problem of the commons comes in. There's something which is free, you overexploit. That's standard kind of argument, and it's a correct argument. It happens when, say, with climate change, emissions is free. The atmosphere as a sink for our emissions of carbon is a free good. So we emit more than we should. It's a tragedy of the commons. That's the kind of problem. And other problems of that sort can be built into this notion of the tragedy of the commons. Which is one reason why people say that we are being myopic. On the other hand, most of us would say we are not myopic. We care about our children. We educate them, we leave them behind. So what's all this about myopia? When we talk about, say, me, myself, I'm not just myself, I have my children, grandchildren, and then future, the dynasty. So maybe the right thing to do is to think about the dynasty. That if you're a thoughtful person, you take into account what you're leaving behind for your children, grandchildren. But it doesn't get us far, because then you've just shifted the unit from the person to the dynasty. But what about dynasties? One, I care about my children, you care about your children, but if I don't care about your children or you don't care about my children, we are back to the same problem. Okay? So the fact that nature does not, when you use nature, you're not paying for it, you overuse it, that argument continues, even if you think of dynastic. So that avenue of argument goes away. It doesn't work. We are back to the problem of overusing the commons. So the diagram that you now got here is an estimate for the United Nations Environment Programme estimate of global capital stocks per capita 1992 to 2014, and broken down into these three: produced, human, and natural capital. Okay? And the estimates, these are very crude, goes without saying. You shouldn't, if you really want accuracy of a kind that you're used to in many other things like life expectancy estimates, then don't do this kind of work. You get your hands dirty. You have to live with what they are. Subject to that, global per capita produced capital between 1992 and 2014 doubled in size, 100% increase. Human capital per capita increased by about 15%, but natural capital per capita declined by 40%. So again, whether you look at these global macroeconomic statistics with all their imperfections, or the detailed micro stories about insect populations disappearing and so forth, they're bringing us a similar viewpoint. And it gives us a flip side of this astonishing improvement in the standard of living over the past 75 or 80 years now, from 1945, or 1950 onwards. So, okay? 1950, the 75 years period where things have gone extremely well. So, I want to just come to the point that I wanted to make, and then, as GDP does not record depreciation of capital, growth and development economics and the economics of poverty should instead be built on the principles of asset management. Instead of GDP, which is a flow, the measure we should ideally deploy is inclusive wealth, the accounting or shadow value of produced capital, human capital, and natural capital, which is a stock. Question why? But this is the trouble. If you're an economist, you go into questions which you might think are boring, but they're essential. So I'm going to be very quick in telling you where I come from on this one. So the question is, all right, why inclusive wealth? What's so big deal about it? It sounds all right, it's stocks. Because it should be related to human well-being. If you start with human well-being, then you need a way to relate well-being and prospects of well-being with the stocks that the economy has at its disposal and the way it wants to use those stocks. So it's like the means and the ends distinction. The stocks of capital are means, well-being are the end, human well-being, let us say, or you can extend the notion of well-being to include other life forms. That's good without saying. But if well-being is the ends and the stocks of capital are the means, then you need a connection between the two. The connection being to find out what the relationship is between the means and the ends, how the means actually deliver the ends, and then to see how, instead of talking about means, you can check whether instead of the ends, you can check whether the ends are improving by looking at whether the means are expanding. That's the idea. Okay? That link. Now you might say, well, why do we need to look at the means? Why not just look at the ends? We can just say, look, life expectancy, food status, degree of inequality, that sort of thing, to see the ends, and then we can describe them. The problem with doing that is that unless you know what is leading to these outcomes, you won't know how to handle policy. You can talk about trying to improve life expectancy or the nutritional status of the poor, but you won't know how to do that if you don't know the means. So that is why we do need to think about means all the time when we talk about the ends, the means to achieving those ends. And for that, you need the question is, how do we do that? Is there an equivalence? So, and the answer is yes. And this may well be my proudest achievement. It's a very trivial theorem, very easy to prove, but when I proved it with the late Karl-Johan Mailer, one of my closest friends, who died 3-4 years ago, is a great economist, we felt happy because we were making a connection between the ends and the means. And the theorem is inclusive wealth, which I've just now defined, corresponds to well-being across the generations. If one of them increases, so does the other. So if the means is the wealth and ends is intergenerational welfare, well-being, not just one generation, but tomorrow's day after, some form of an idea of intergenerational well-being. The utilitarian philosophers have a very standard notion of it, which is add up the well-being of all future generations. And you can use that, but you don't have to be. You could be a Kantian, you could be an Aristotelian, doesn't matter. If you have a sense of what it is that you are after, what it makes for human flourishing, then is there a corresponding measure of the means for achieving human flourishing? And that's the theorem. It says, give me a notion of human flourishing over time, and I will be able to construct a value of the stocks of capital assets, which, taken together, add them up, which we call inclusive wealth, will have the feature that if wealth increases, human flourishing increases. If human flourishing increases, the corresponding measure of wealth increases. The two go together. Okay, so you can either read the progress or regress of an economy by looking at the improvements in the ends, or equivalently, you can look at it by measuring changes in the means. We economists tend to always search for means because we deal with goods, stocks, which are not necessarily ends. They're means, like this desk. And I think there is virtue in that. It's the division of labor. It's for you, sir, to think about the ends, and it's for me to think about the means. Okay? So inclusive wealth is it. That theorem is an absolutely rock bottom one and should guide us. Now, one of the things in my kind of way of doing things, economics, is to search for the pristine, the Platonic theorem, if you like, but then say, I can't do it. Then move backwards, and then see how to approximate it. Okay? So this theorem is important because it tells us what is ideal. That if you can, but then somebody says, how are you going to measure inclusive wealth? It's just huge. Think of all the Amazon forest and the coastal riverines and so forth. How are you going to do that? Well, that's when you back off. And you back off and say, well, we know at the end of the day, that's what we have an equivalence theorem between inclusive wealth and human flourishing. But now we look at the components of inclusive wealth. We know that it's a sum of the values of all the assets. But what we might want to do is to just break up that sum and study them separately. And in some sense, that's what I did in this diagram. I've already done that. I've broken it up into 3 types of capital assets. And I didn't sum produced capital, human capital, and natural capital, which would have been the wealth. Okay? So I think that's the way to progress. You break it up into small bits and concentrate on each of the bits and see how they've gone. And then maybe periodically try and do an aggregation exercise and see whether wealth is real. So the ideal is wealth, inclusive wealth, but in practice, we have to back off and look at the components. So it's a bit like your medical practitioner, your GP, who gives you an overall assessment, and you can talk about your health. Or then, similarly, they say, look, never mind your health, but you really ought to care a little bit about your weight. Are you walking? Do you take exercises, and so forth? Or your muscles, and so forth. So you look at the components and worry about it. But of course, at the end of the day, you would say, well, general health. So that's how I see it. So another feature, important feature, I think, of looking at this theorem, is that it tells us that we should not create ad hoc measures of human flourishing. And I think that has been the main difficulty I have with my colleagues at the United Nations, in the United Nations Development Program, the Human Development Index, and so forth. Because the approach there was to look at aspects of the human condition which we value, and then create an index of it. And the Human Development Index is precisely that. It's got GDP per capita, it's got life expectancy, and it's got literacy. Why? Because literacy and life expectancy are parts of human capital, and GDP per capita, well, it's output. So you can see now there's a lack of, in creating the Human Development Index, there was a complete absence of a theoretical basis for creating it. Now you can do that. Of course, you can do that, it's a free country. But it doesn't really help you very much. You need an analytical core from which to create the indices that you want. You can't have inclusive wealth, but you then break it up so that at least you know what you've broken up comes from something that you ideally want. And the Human Development Index doesn't have any such framework. So I have been somewhat critical of that. I want to make a few final comments which are useful for us to think about. I have certainly found it very, very helpful. Nature's goods and services, we tend on the whole to not distinguish them too much. But I found the classification, the natural classification that is currently in use, very, very helpful. Provisioning goods and regulating and maintenance services. Provisioning goods are food, water, timber, fibers, pharmaceutical products, and non-living material. In other words, look at these title. They are all the factors which together go to make for a GDP growth and so forth. Okay. They're the, if you like, the fundamental stuff that we use for transaction purposes and construction. And regulating and maintenance services, notice the word goods and notice the word services. Services are flows, goods are stocks, durables. So food, water, timber, fibers, products, and non-living material, these are durable objects. Regulating and maintenance services, on the other hand, are, if you like, the background infrastructure within which provisioning goods are created. And they involve climate regulation, decomposition of waste, nitrogen fixation, air and water purification, soil regeneration, pollination, and so forth. All these services that Mother Nature is offering us, which we don't notice necessarily in our urban life, is happening all the time. Soil regeneration is an incredibly complex science. The science involved is still ongoing, with the role of fungus, the role of bacteria in decomposition. Still ongoing research, but it's happening. We know that it's happening. And we need to understand these natural processes, okay, which are transforming goods into other goods over time. And we have increasingly, the trouble is we have increasingly drawn on nature's regulating and maintenance services to provide ourselves with provisioning goods by mining, quarrying, and otherwise transforming the landscape. Forests making way for agriculture and plantations, grassland transforming into pasture land. There is thus an inevitable tension between provisioning goods on the one hand and regulating and maintenance services on the other. But regulating and maintenance services are fundamental. Without them, there would be no provisioning goods. This distinction is really, in my understanding today, is absolutely key to something that most of us are actually aware of. We do worry about the fact that the soils are deteriorating or that we are using too much fertilizers. We do worry about it. All of us have, from time to time, read about them, have views on them, and so forth. But what I'm trying to do here is to show how to organize the thoughts around them, to see what the distinctions are, and why regulating and maintenance services are the real phenomenon. The provisioning goods, in some sense, are the epiphenomena. I know they're terribly important because that's food and water and so forth. But from nature's point of view, they are the epiphenomena. Nature doesn't give a damn about us, right? So we are here and we are part of nature, but there's no such thing as being special. So for me, regulating and maintenance services are now the key. It's like the background environment within which we are operating. And so in some sense, much of what we call environmental and resource economics concentrates on provisioning goods. And that has been a weakness of the discipline. I'm in part of it. I think I was president of the European Association of Environmental and Resource Economics, not of ecological economics. I've never been there. And they are doing much more important work, the ecological economists, because they are talking in the language that I'm now discussing here, instead of looking at only provisioning goods, which is what environmental and resource economists do, with concentrating a lot on regulating and maintenance services. Okay? When we economists talk about substitution possibilities, I want to make a couple of points on this, because I've been much influenced in my understanding, the way I react to these matters, by my American colleagues, who have a very strong belief in substitution possibilities. And one reason they do is they look at, these are my friends, by the way, so it's not a criticism, I'm just suggesting that even friends can go a bit wrong. So it's the idea that if you run out of something, you can construct a substitute. Okay, plastics have substituted for many, many other things. And of course, it's true. Human progress has been a constant expansion of processes and to enable us to substitute our way out of scarcities. Something runs out, then through ingenuity and using some other raw materials, you construct. In the past, during colonial period, the substitution possibilities were, if you run out of something in this place, you get it from another place. And if both are colonies, that's fine. That makes it easy. But you see what I mean. The idea is of substitution possibilities. And the reason we think about substitution possibilities is because of our experience, of course, but it's limiting because it limits our attention to provisioning goods. When it comes to maintenance and regulating services, we're not talking about substitution possibilities. We're looking at these are complementary processes because they're coming out of processes. These are services. So climate regulation is related to the pattern of rainfall, the water runoffs. So these, you can't say, let me substitute. We try and do it through provisioning goods. I'll come to that in a minute. But typically, if you want to say, well, I want to substitute one maintenance and regulating services for another, that's not going to be on offer. Nature is not going to give you that service. What you do, of course, is to substitute away from the difficulties that you face if one of the regulating and maintenance services is under stretch. Okay, build better buildings or something like that. But you're making substitute possibilities on the provisioning goods, but not on the maintenance and regulating services. So one way to identify difference between provisioning goods on the one hand and regulating and maintenance services on the other is to recognize that the biosphere is a dynamical system. Provisioning goods are stocks, which are recursively mapped from one period to the next, carrying stocks. So the forms of the functions that constitute the mapping are the regulating and maintenance services. This remark is really meant for those of us here in the audience who like a mathematical treatment of what I've been saying. And that's the distinction, really. So one way of thinking about the distinction is think of a fisheries model. So you have a pond, which is the prototypical fisheries model, which some of you will be familiar with. Considers a pond, let us say, which is producing a constant flow of nutrients in which there is a dominant fish population living. Okay? Now, in steady state, fish die, but they're replaced in an equal amount so that on average the population remains constant. And you can model it. Fisheries literature is very rich, old, and there is a good deal of experience in estimating the production functions of fish. So it's a standard model of growth of fisheries. If the stock is low, then there is ample food, population grows. As population grows on that constant food supply, then at the margin each fish receives less nutrients, so the growth reduces. And then the growth actually starts declining if there is too much competition for the nutrients, until the steady state is one where birds are replaced, the deaths are replaced by birds. The population remains pretty much constant. Now, in such a world, the stock is the provisioning good is the stock of fish. But the maintenance and regulating services are the functional form of this reproductive story that I've just now mentioned. Okay. So, again, these rather loose notions can be given full articulation. Okay? So the biosphere as a whole, the provisioning wood will be the stocks of all the stuff out there, rocks and forests and so forth, both inanimate and animate objects. And the maintenance and regulating services are the processes by which they're changing over time, the dynamical system. Okay? That's the idea. And we concentrate on provisioning goods, but we really need to be concerned about the maintenance and regulating services, which are not substitutes. Well, that was the model of the fisheries, by the way, just to describe. I'm going to skip over it. Hello. How do I? Sorry, can you get me out of this problem? I think I'm almost through with what the comments I wanted to make. No problem. I'm sorry, I should have. Right. I think, it's not moving now. Sorry. Okay.
Using this scroll.
Yes, okay.
Only this one.
Yeah, that's fine. Now, the global demand of the human economy makes of provisioning goods has in recent decades outstripped their generation rate. So I have been, over the past few years, tried to construct a conception of the global economy and our use of natural resources, of nature, along the lines that are now outlined, namely provisioning goods, maintenance and regulating services, and tried to construct an idea of what we mean by our overreach. What do we mean when we say there's an overreach of the human economy on nature? And so, for example, on the currently over climate change, of course, the idea of overreach is pretty straightforward. They say if net emissions are positive, there is at this moment, it's the ability of the atmosphere to recycle it declines, so more of it remains in the atmosphere, leaving and increasing in the greenhouse effect, and so forth. Now, net zero is an expression of the desire to bring the two into equality, namely the emissions and the way, the rate at which it is absorbed. So, turning to the aggregate level, and I come back now to the previous, by one estimate, using land use changes for estimating changes in the flow of these services, the global demand for provisioning goods, which we can call the human ecological footprint, some ecologists call it the footprint, I'm calling it the demand for provisioning goods, today exceeds the regeneration rate of provisioning goods. The ratio is about 1.7. So there, in other words, we think of the biosphere as a regenerative resource, which it is. It regenerates, but the seasons, for example, is a way of regeneration. What we are taking out exceeds the natural regeneration rate. In the same way, I come back to the fisheries model. If you take more out from the pond than they're reproducing, then the stock is going to decline. That metaphor is extremely useful in my judgment. It can be used on the global scale as well. And the ratio is 1.7. And that's why people say we need 1.7 Earths to meet human demands. And well, it can't be done. I will stop at these observations because it tells us that we now have, I think, in some sense, a conceptual apparatus for reducing this incredibly complicated set of exchanges that define the human condition today, with nearly 8.2 billion people, with desire for increasing the standard of living, which are placing pressure on the Earth system. And we need to think about how to use ingenuity, or perhaps, heaven forbid, try and economize our use of nature. That might require, and the finger does point to the richest 1% of the world's population, which uses up so much resources relative to others. I think they seem distractions, but they are of fundamental importance for us to imagine how best to, in some sense, even out the human use of nature, because we have an overshoot, no question. When I say 1.7, you don't have to believe that figure, but think of the insect extinction rates. Their data are coming from various ends, all pointing in the same direction. That globally, there is an overreach, and that can't be sustained. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for the excellent presentation. And now is the time for questions. As we have the simultaneous translation, there is a possibility to pose the question in Hungarian or in English as well. Tehát köszönjük az előadást, és most kérdések jönnek. Magyarul is föl lehet tenni a kérdéseket, mert hogy van szinkrontolmácsolásunk, úgyhogy kérem szépen, hogy a bátor jelentkezőket, és mikrofont pedig hozzuk.
Just contrast, I would raise, sorry, my name is Janusz Linsky, I'm teaching here at this faculty, and what I'm trying to ask now here in public is something we started discussing yesterday, namely, this research was commissioned by the UK Treasury, and it will be really interesting for us here in Hungary to see whether there are any initiatives in Britain to implement these recommendations, and if yes, what are the starting steps of this implementation? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah. I used my time in my opening remarks to give the intellectual basis for the applications and the policies that emerge, because policies without a background theory for why the policies are being designed are unlikely to be fruitful. So I concentrated not on the policy, but on the background reasoning under which policy needs to be enacted. Now, the UK Treasury, of course, some of the policy implications are fairly straightforward. One of them, which I tried to identify, was we should be trying to estimate stocks. And yet, of course, national accounts are mainly about flows. And for good reason. They're easier to measure than stocks. Stocks have, one reason stocks are hard to measure is not the physical picture, that you can describe, but the value, social value, the shadow value, is that stocks embody the future. A building, the value of this building is the services the building will be supplying over its lifetime, which could be another 100 years, who knows, with repair and maintenance and so forth. So you need a picture of future prospects in order to be able to value a stock. Now, in some sense, of course, markets do that. Markets do that not because markets is sort of clever, but it's humans, and they have, each of us brings with us a picture of what the future holds, and somehow that gets aggregated into the value of a building even. The market value of a building will depend on people's perception, what lies ahead. Is there a war likely to happen? If it's going to be peaceful, and so forth. All the various paraphernalia that you can think of, the conditions which will change the value. So stocks, that's why stocks are hard to measure, because no two people will value the stock in the same way, for their pictures of the future will be different. But the market does some kind of an aggregation. The problem with natural capital is, of course, many of them don't have any market. That's why so much of the attention amongst environmental and resource economists is about valuation of natural capital, because there is no obvious. Think of the oceans. We think it's a free good. We treat it as a free good. We just go on. Nobody pays a rent for sailing across the Atlantic. They pay a transport cost, but not the rent. If the Atlantic was owned by somebody, boy, would he be a rich person, because he would charge a rent for every. And yet, in some sense, you feel that the human community should charge a rent from itself for its use. And of course, that will raise billions of dollars, but the point about it would be that it could be reinvested in maintaining the oceans, if nothing else. We forget how much we could achieve if we charged. In my review, I suggested an international organization which charges for the use of the oceans, the cruise ships, I don't mean use of the ports, I mean the use of the oceans, okay? And not just cruise ships, but all the trillions of dollars of merchandise that are flowing across, which are sailing across the Pacific, Atlantic, and Indian Oceans. They should not be free. They should be charged by the world community, the global community. And that could be used for so many purposes. In my review, I tried to argue that it could be, just a fraction could be used in buying up or paying Brazil not to deforest the Amazon. That requires billions of dollars. The negotiation, obviously. Brazil will get President Trump to represent them, and the rest of us will have to negotiate a better deal for ourselves, okay? But the point I'm trying to get at is, that is it. You could be using rents from global public goods, common property resources, to pay for global public goods which are specific to regions. This is the one difference between the oceans and, say, the Amazon rainforest. The Amazon rainforest is a global public good. It affects the entire wind system, wind patterns, but it's located in a particular set of nations, within a particular set of nations, and that makes for an interesting difference. They could legitimately say, well, why do we care about, why should we have to look after the whole of the world? So we need to develop, says Brazil, so we're cutting down the Amazon forest on a regular basis when we need to. The rest of the world, instead of complaining, should say, no, we can pay for these ecosystem services, the way now it's very often, that's the expression, payment for ecosystem services. We could do that globally. And for that you need to raise billions. And you could do that by charging for the use of the commons. And so these are prescriptions, genuine prescriptions that are in the review. But I was told when the review came out in 2021, February, by the Treasury, UK Treasury, which had sponsored the review, kept my team for the remaining 12 months and 9 months for dissemination purposes. So they, of course, they were very active. My team was very active, and so I had a regular set of interviews and meetings to attend. It was during the COVID period, so it was all done by Zoom. So that was fine. I raised this matter at various levels, at the UN level of the UN, World Bank, IMF, because they were involved in discussions with me, not because they wanted to talk to me, but that the Treasury organized them. And I would raise this matter periodically. The answer I got was, yes, it's all very well, of course, theoretically you're correct. I said, no, it's not just theoretically correct, it's a genuine policy or option we have. And say, well, the problem is people are tired of creating international, or we don't have the appetite for creating another international institution. Because the idea was that there should be an international institution with monitoring the global commons and then charging for it, having the power to charge for it, and then dispersing the money in whichever way is feasible. I don't know, that's not my problem, it's for the organizations of the United Nations. And the answer was, the world does not have the appetite. Now, these are people who are sitting in New York. I didn't believe one word of them. Why should they judge what the world is prepared for or not? It's really a question of whether you think you have the energy to create an international institution. And the one point I had to make was, yes, fine, but at the end of the Second World War, the world was on its knees. Europe was on its knees. America was triumphant, maybe, but we really had a huge reconstruction problem. And what came of it? World Bank was created, IMF, and all the subsidiaries. They were all created during that period to face up to the fact that the world economy was shattered by the war. Now, why? Of course, as an economist interested in Mother Nature, and really works about Mother Nature as the most significant object that we have, creature that we have, to me, I found that to be a revolting response. Because I said, well, this is a crisis. This is about as big a crisis as we faced at the end of the Second World War. We don't know it because it's not happening in the way, but these disappear. These data that I've been giving are sort of playing along and are creating problems which are increasingly felt by the world's poorest people. Think of people in the Amazon forest, the indigenous population. They get evicted. They're shot. They're killed. The culture is destroyed because there's a mine out there. This is happening before our eyes. And that's the extreme case. Then think of all the other, less extreme cases where indigenous populations are moved because a road has to be built or for development purposes and so forth. So these tensions are being faced all the time. And the ones that involve Mother Nature are the ones that interest me, at least certainly should interest us, what we are talking about here today. So I found that to be very hard to understand as to why the UN, the World Bank, that the international institutions don't recognize that we do have a crisis. We do have an entire set of problems which were not part of the reasoning that led to the creation of the World Bank, these international agencies. It was not part of the language in 1947, 1948 when they were being constructed. But now this language is looming, staring at us in the face, and why can't we think of creating one? So I don't know what eventually, I don't know unless there's a serious crisis, but just at the moment, I don't see any way forward. There's nothing happening, absolutely none at all. World Bank every now and then makes noises, but if you read the World Development Report, what we've been discussing here is absent. The annual World Development Report. There we are.
Thank you very much. The discussion is getting more and more exciting. Your comments. I'm Antal Ferenc-Kovács. I teach environmental economics at the John von Neumann University. You authorized me to ask challenging questions. So I have two questions. Sure. It seems there are several ongoing processes in the world. Sorry? Several ongoing processes and developments around the world which pursue those policies or those sorts in a global sense, a global scale, what you recommend, and that the United Nations established and designed a statistical standard which...
Yeah, sure.
Oh, okay. So the United Nations designed the statistical division, designed a statistical standard which is being implemented around the world, ecosystem accounts and so forth. And the World Bank has an extensive global program on helping developing countries to establish their statistical capacities and capacity building. Now, do you think this is enough? Because it's quite clear that this kind of view is basically being implemented globally. The other question is that implicitly you spoke about sustainability in a weak and a strong sense. Do you think that really makes sense to distinguish these two criteria for sustainability? I mean, whether we check if, or we analyze if inclusive wealth as a sum of capital assets increases or not, or we just concentrate on ecosystems and natural capital, or changes in natural capital. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Well, thanks. Thank you very much. This is very good. I don't have obviously, I'll be just giving a knee-jerk response, gut feeling I have. I think the bank is right on this. That is, what it can do is not to point its finger at different countries, then it will be out of business if it does that too often, but to provide facilities to countries to be able to act on what it's recommending. And I think the World Bank is probably right in setting up institutional frameworks within countries, or advising them as to how to have, say, create parallel national accounts on stocks and so forth. I think that's the right thing to do, and it's for the nations, individual countries, to decide what to concentrate on. It can't do everything, but it can concentrate on certain. Brazil would be wanting to concentrate on, presumably, forests, and so forth. Bangladesh on the coastal habitats, including mangroves and so forth. So, because nature appears in different guises in different countries, regions, and so that goes without saying. I think the bank is probably right in essentially offering assistance in creating departments to do that. So that's my first. And the second, sorry, what was the second? Oh, I see. Okay. No, I think I have not been particularly. I don't think it is the weak which obviously we ought to be thinking of. I mean, and then the strong. Okay, the weak sustainability, strong sustainability, at least one way of thinking about the distinction is that the strong is looking at the components of increasing wealth and seeing whether each of the components, the stocks of each of the components, forests, coral reefs and so forth, they are maintained as we go through time. And the weak one would be aggregating it into a wealth figure, let's say, and ask whether wealth is increasing. And inclusive wealth could be increasing because some of the assets are expanding through, and maybe even at the expense of some others which are declining. Now, in the world we live in, it'll be weak, which will be an operation, goes without saying, because we'll be cutting into things. I mean, otherwise it's unreal. Growing population, rising standard of living, desired standard of living in terms of GDP per capita are going to make further and further pressure on natural capital. So it's not going to be strong, it'll have to be weak. The question is the trade-off between which you allow, which are important and which are not. I mean, these are big things, and I don't know how to think about them even other than just clarify the distinction. So yes, it will be the weak that has to be, in some sense, accepted. Subject to, well, we have in our own legal system, in our cultural systems of all countries, there are priorities. Some things are more important than others. The legal system has that too. I mean, it goes without saying. Some misdemeanors are worse than other misdemeanors. So the idea that you need to break down aggregate notions into its components and treat them differently is a commonplace. And I think weak sustainability is what we're led to rather than strong, because we have to make those compromises given the. I mean, obviously, strong has a visceral appeal. We don't destroy anything, any component. But we are going to be doing it. And we have to think about trade-offs and which ones are to be valued. So, I take now, and particularly reading the anthropological literature, I take the religious views of societies to be of extreme importance when we think about natural capital. In the West, at least in England, the UK, these spiritual values may have been given a short shift, at least in the public domain. I think it's an extreme big mistake, by the way, not to allow for that. People are embarrassed talking about it. I don't know why they're embarrassed, given the fact that people do have spiritual values, but it's been undermined so strongly over my own lifetime here. It's undermined, and I had, of course, some tendency because I was sensitivity to it because I was raised in India, and there the spiritual issues are, you're not embarrassed about it. In fact, it's there, and it's part of life, and it's something that matters. You love your mother, you love your father, your children, and you care about God or big what?
Secularization is over the principle of secularization.
So that's I think that's how I see the world. But I think we do need. I don't think it's going to be revived anytime soon. Certainly not in the UK. But loss of spiritual values, and I don't mean necessarily religious spirituality. I'm thinking now about having a religious experience, as I have, in the Kakadu National Park in the northern wetlands of Australia. I mean, you go there in an evening, and you're absolutely awestruck of what's going on. I don't know if you've ever visited it, but if you get a chance, don't miss it. It's it's like the Garden of Eden. It's magnificent wetland, and the bird life, and you can see, and you on a little boat, and sitting there and watching the evening draw close. They're incredible. So when I mention spiritual values, of course I do very much that the spiritual values that come out of encountering nature in a deeper way than we do. And that relates to a point that I did emphasize in my review, which was education. That with 60% of the global population living in urban areas, there is a deep concern that we should all have of losing touch with natural capital, with trees, shrubs, the soil, all the muck out there. And so the final chapter had a plea for a reform of the education, at least in the UK, since it was a report written for the UK, it may not be relevant here, was to revise the educational system to include nature studies from the earlier stages, so that children get a familiarity with muck, with dirt, and so forth. It's beginning to happen. The GCSEs, everything happens slowly. GCSEs, that is the 2 years before the final A levels, that's the final school. So we are looking at children of about 15 or so. They have to take it's not compulsory yet. There would be a nature studies, environmental studies program, which will involve some field work as well, obviously. And that's probably why it's optional yet, because field work is expensive. And if you're in an inner city school, high school, getting close to nature is a sweat. It's maybe too costly. Who knows? I don't know how it's going to go. But it's something that's extremely important in my judgment from the earliest stages of our life to have that as a really compulsory. It's not just the 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic, but reading, writing, arithmetic, and nature, or nature, reading, writing, and arithmetic. And I think that's really crucial. And it's crucial for a very practical reason. It's not to improve our souls necessarily. I mean, that's there, but it's not, as a secular scientist, that's not my... it's important because until we internalize the desire to protect Mother Nature, it's going to be really hard. You need incentives, which is what we economists think about always, are not there. I mean, it's not possible. In some sense, creating incentives destroys some of the intention behind it. You don't need an incentive to care about your mother. You have it. But incentives does mean that there's a dislocation between you and the object, and we want to, it'll be useful to remove that if possible. So the education is of central importance in my judgment, and I made a plea for that. And it's happening. There are people who have taken this up, educationists in the UK. They are in touch with me. And, I mean, I can't do anything more. I don't have any technical expertise, but they have taken up the cause, and they're trying to influence the industry of education. That's been, in some sense, the one great success of the review. I think people have been asking me since yesterday, how has the review been received? It was received very favorably. There's no ifs and buts about it. I've not seen any criticism at all, but unless they're whispering in the dark, I don't know. But no, it has been very well received, both by the government but of course, there's no obvious thing for a government to do in response to the review. There's no, because it's not do this or do that. I was very keen on not pointing my finger at anything and instructing governments what to do. There's no such sentence there. It's for governments to take up whatever they feel they can, or departments can take. And they have taken up, I think the education side has been the most influential one, at least in the UK. Whether it has influenced, say, development policy, building policy, and so forth, I do not know. I rather suspect not. One reason is that the demand for now, for example, housing in the UK is so strong, so powerful, that it's now, the planning laws are being changed so that you can have more and more development eating into. And that makes me one final observation in this round of thinking, which I think is really very useful, to distinguish between protection of biodiversity, which is what my review was about, and climate change, which was the previous review. And that is, climate change is in some sense remote from the individual's ability to influence. We are all small fries. I'm not being able to influence the climate, nor you. It's the totality of our activities which is doing that. And it's remote in the sense that it's a global public bad. So each of us feels we can't do very much, and in any case, there's nothing what we do affects, because we are one of 8.2 billion people. Whereas biodiversity has a very strong neighborhood aspect to it. It's not just biodiversity writ large, how many species are there, at what rate are there, which is, I was discussing that. It depends on whether you have some green space in your neighborhood. That's part of biodiversity. So I think one of the attractive features of studying biodiversity and thinking about policy is that biodiversity now on, let's say, green space, let's just think of it that way, is it's local. Each of us can be engaged in it because we can influence our neighbors. So even a small neighborhood could say, well, look, we have this plot of land, which is there. We could have the council wants a house to be built because there is a pressure for housing, but we're going to resist it and keep it as a place where the kids can play, or we can go for walks in the evening. This is happening all the way in Cambridge all the time. And there you can actually have an effect because you can influence council if you're politically inclined to be able to, in local politics. I mean, here we're not looking at global politics. So I think there's one sense in which biodiversity is something each of us can do something about, because it's not a global writ large. It affects the birds and the insects in our garden or in our neighborhood when we go for walks. I think that's one of the great features of it, and is a reason why we think that it's more soluble as a problem than climate change. But of course, the two are related to each other. One feeds onto the other. That's a problem. I know that. But nevertheless, within what's happening in the atmosphere, there's some things that you can do locally. So I think local engagement, political engagement, is something that we ought to think a lot more about when we think about environmental problems. And in my new book, I have a whole chapter on that to show how local activities, including NGOs in particular, local NGOs, I don't mean the global ones, but the local NGOs, have done marvelous stuff in the rainforests of India and elsewhere, of galvanizing local people to protect their space.
Well, thank you very much for the answer and all the speech. Now we have to stop the questions. There will be an opportunity to pose questions after the roundtable discussion as well.
Okay.
Now we're going to have a short break with some refreshments outside, and as well we've asked the professor to make dedications here, so everyone has the book. Everyone has his book, so whoever would like to have some words written in it, you have the option now during the break. Thank you very much, and we're going to continue in 30 minutes. So welcome back, everybody. We are going to continue our conference with the second part, which is going to comprise of two parts. The first is a surprise. because we have invited two young artists from the Bartók Béla Conservatory. They are first grade students. Regina Hidvégi, she's studying flute, and Kis Márté Benedek is studying piano, and they are going to play two pieces for us today. First, they're going to play Spring for Flute and Piano by Herman Bifting, is a contemporary composer. And then Máté is going to play Liszt 6th Hungarian Rhapsody for us. So please welcome our young artists. thank you very much for the beautiful music. And so now, after that we bodily and spiritually refreshed, it's time to feed our brain again. So I would like to welcome the members of our panel discussion. First, of course, Sir Partha Dasgupta, our main guest for today, who you already met. And then ladies first, Alexandra Köves, docent, teacher, professor at Corvinus University, and Mr. László Pintér from the CEU University. May I ask you to introduce yourself with a few words so that the wider audience would know you a bit? And then I will give the floor to them. And László, I will ask you to please keep in control, and let's continue this very exciting discussion that the speech of Mr. Dasgupta has just started. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for, yes. Thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. This is a true honor. My name is Alexandra Köves. I'm associate professor at the Corvinus University of Budapest. I am also head of the Research Center for Ecological Economics at the Corvinus Institute of Advanced Studies. And maybe two other titles that I'd like to share. One is that I'm president of the European Society for Ecological Economics. And also I am host of the podcast series called Economics for Rebels. And I think this last one is probably quite important in terms of introducing where I come from, because I'm probably being invited a little bit for provocation, as I come from more of a degrowth background. So even among ecological economics, I'm considered a radical. So I think that's why I'm here, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Good. Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to join distinguished panel. Tremendously enjoyed your presentation. The most important point is that I'm not an economist. I come more from the natural sciences, agronomy, and natural resources management. I wear two hats. I'm a senior fellow with the International Institute for Sustainable Development in Winnipeg, Canada, and that's been going on since '94. And then I'm also teaching at Central European University in Vienna. The important thing to say maybe is that. Actually, I'm going to refer right to our experience a minute ago here. When I was heading the measurement and indicators program at IISD for quite a few years, and after spending many years on trying to come up with the metrics and the numbers and evidence based on these assumptions that evidence matters, I found myself drawn to the importance of getting across to people in other ways, including through art. That might seem almost contradictory. And also through spirituality. And thank you for putting that on the table, because that might not have been expected in this context, but given where we stand and given the enormity of the challenge, I just thinking truly holistically the science policy interface, but also including these softer aspects of science, of art and spirituality. I think those are very important. Okay, so I'll stop my introduction, so to say, there. And since I was asked to also kind of facilitate to the extent possible this sort of fireside chat, I think I'm going to grab the opportunity right here and going to turn to this question of provocation. that you raised. Why don't, if you're okay with that, I'm sure you've been provoked throughout the years. So why don't we start right there? So if you would like to raise some sort of questions about what was said, and then you respond, and I'll also weigh in. Yeah, Alex.
Thank you so much. I think it's important to see that we are all economists being worried about the state of nature and being worried about how our current economic system is treating nature and where this is leading. And but while we agree on the fundamental problems, probably there's a vivid and fine-grained spectrum of where we stand in terms of whether we can reform the current structures and whether we can use the tools, the methods, the language of the mainstream economic thought, or whether we need to turn to radically different language notions and start questioning the very fundamentals of our economics. And I think we don't know where change is coming from. I'm not saying one is right and the other one is wrong. The concern is there for both parties. It's just a question whether we believe that by using, for example, the language of current economics, whether that's going to lead us anywhere, or we're just getting stuck with the mental image and the social constructions of what we have currently. And when I said I come from a more radical one, all I mean is that we want the same thing, but maybe I have the feeling that we need different words for them. We need to rethink what we mean by well-being. We need to rethink what we mean by assets, stocks, flows. What do we include? And you're using the term inclusive, but still, we just heard this wonderful music, and I think it's part of our well-being to hear such music. Is it a stock? Is it a flow? But it is part of our well-being. So we can't necessarily equate inclusive wealth with well-being when we have such intangible things to include. So I guess the first thing I'd like to raise, and this is the kind of provocation, is that what we read from your work and what we hear is more of using the same terminology that economists, mainstream economists, understand. And I think that's wonderful. We don't know where change is coming from, so maybe change is coming from that side, using the same tools. But can we really solve such a problem by using the same tools, or do we have to really reinvent the social constructions?
Yeah. Thank you very much. Gosh, I wouldn't be in a position to answer that. These are deep questions. I don't know the answer to them, really. But I have some gut feelings, and they come out of, I guess, experience of some kind. I think what you're raising is very important. You're asking whether tinkering around with sort of the way knowledge develops typically is you work on the last paper you read. So it's all incremental, but it's also therefore path dependent. It's very rare that somebody shoots off and opens up a field. People have done it, but you don't know in advance whether it's going to be a good idea or not. If it doesn't get taken up, it's forgotten. And sometimes it's revived, but mostly we work at the margins of what exists. And it's very understandable. That's how it is, how it goes. And I think one way of opening up the discussion is to reinterpret, at least in my language, what you're saying is to say, well, that may not be adequate. Just at the moment we need to have a big break, as it were. I think there's a good deal of truth in that, probably. But the hard thing is to know how to break it, and where to go, how to fashion something. People have tried. There have been lots of very good imaginative authors over the decades who have thought with a slightly different language. I wouldn't have used those languages myself, but that's because of my training, nothing else. It's not as though I have people like Schumacher in mind, for example, who wrote in the 60s, 70s, something like that. Extremely interesting work. But it's a language that doesn't come very naturally to me, not because I disagree with it, but because these are more vision-oriented as opposed to a workable set of things that you can do. And now you might say you can do things, workable things that you can do by breaking away. Of course, it goes without saying, that can happen. And that should happen probably. I just don't know how to do it. It's my limitation, not the subject's limitation. And I've always taken the view, that's because of my limitations, I mean, I should be making it absolutely clear. I've never been a real revolutionary or anything like that. I think what I've tried to do is to identify missing objects in our discourse and bring it to centrality, if possible. It remains missing, so I've been unsuccessful to date, because you get nature mentioned in economic reports as footnotes. And there is natural capital, would be the first footnote. And then you can proceed as with business as usual. So it's not been really very successful, except for those who are already engaged in it. But it's like sort of separate groups talking to each other. If you go to the World Bank, you will find that there is an environmental department, which doesn't necessarily do the things in the way we would be discussing here, but at least they're trying. But it's a minor subsidiary department. It has very little influence on the annual World Development Report, and which is, in some sense, the communication channel with the rest of the world of how the bank thinks. And I can go on repeating this for other international institutions. So there is a kind of a lip service to our concerns that are... Now that doesn't tell me that we have to make a clean break, and largely because I don't know what a clean break really means, or how to... I'd like to see it happen, that'll be fine. So what I've always tried to do is to identify missing items in our normal discourse and see how introducing it makes a difference. In some sense, my review was an attempt at putting together, say, 40 years of thinking about and working on this into a concrete set of bringing natural capital centrally into the discourse. And one reason I could make it into a central is that everything is built on it. Everything we do, we are built on natural capital. We ourselves are part of natural capital. That's what we are. We are organisms. Advanced in some ways of having consciousness, but we are nevertheless organisms subject to the biological, the processes that guide the biosphere. Goes without saying, and we should not forget that. And in some sense, we don't forget it. In fact, we need to learn it, because I think the one big mistake the Enlightenment has done to us is to have shifted our attention away from that fact into making us into unique, detachable objects to be admired, respected for our beauty, our intelligence, and so forth. I mean, all you have to do is to look at any Michelangelo's sculptures, and you see, boy, oh boy, we are looking at a different conception of the human for me, it's much more, to me, I've looked at very, very many museums over my lifetime to see where in art we see nature at work. And I've seen it only at one place. I mean, of course you see it a lot in Cézanne and so forth, but what's that? Clean landscapes. That's not nature, that's an external view of nature. The only one I've come across is, of course, as usual, Van Gogh. There is a painting of his, and I've forgotten the title. It's muck. You can see the dirt. You know, it's almost falling onto your lap. It's a picture of of a wetland or something. I can't remember now what it is, but it's the bottom, lower half is the base of the forest, as it were. And you can almost see the leaves falling onto your lap. And so he got it pretty much right in seeing nature as muck, as it were. And that's because we have refined our notion of nature to make it into a clean visual, which sort of satisfies our aesthetic sense. So I think in many ways, I'm trying to point out that I think intellectualizing nature has limits which you have reached. And an emotional connection is what we should be, at least I'm tending towards, if you like, and I'm emphasizing that, because all the stuff I write about, or all the stuff that you write about or think about, are intellectualizing nature. Mm. And that's well worth doing, obviously, goes without saying. But I think I've seen beginning to see the limits of it. Mm-hmm. Hence, the emphasis I've made at the end of my talk on education, because if you get an emotional connection to nature, in the way Van Gogh obviously did in his paintings, then that's, I think, the beginnings of an understanding of our place in nature and our understanding of ourselves, because I think the detachment has been a disaster, the detachment that we have created, that we stand apart. And that is the Enlightenment project, as I read it. And I think it is played out. I don't know if this makes sense.
Okay, maybe let's just reflect on that a bit. I remember Dana Meadows used to introduce herself as a farmer and a systems dynamicist. So this, besides that intellectual side, there was also this very personal and very practical, and that really made, I think, special. So, and you were also referring to the idea of biodiversity not being just far and abstract and purely intellectual, but actually very personal and personable by something that we can engage with, and I think that's a promising. There's a promise in that. And I think I like that because it's actionable, and all the sort of the universal work that is going on, and we're also doing a lot of that on, now the term is nature-based solutions, but is there a path from that to some larger outcomes that we have to see at scales where we have to see them? So I think that is, in a sense, I think, a challenge.
Yeah. I think, sorry, okay. Can you hear me? I can't hear.
Yeah.
Okay. It's tough. I mean, I want to be very brief because I have very little to say about it. In some sense, this is a problem where I think, in some deep sense, we can see where we should be heading, given the fact that periodically, from time to time, when we are lucky, we get a glimpse of that which we should be heading towards. But in our day-to-day life, of course, we miss it out. I was alluding to my own experience at the Kakadu National Park. It's not a kind of feeling that you have very often, for the reason that you're not in such a place as the Kakadu National Park very often. But if you are, you get that sense. And of course, you're not there. You can still get it in that sense in many other places. You can sit by the river Ganges and feel that, and so forth. So I think in a way this emotional connection, which I'm suggesting, is something we can try and invoke. I think it's and I don't think it's not to come back to the original point that was being made about the language of economics. I think there is a kind of misunderstanding. Economics is a tool. It's a tool, it's a language we create to try and understand our sense of the conflicting needs and desires that we all have, and the conflicting options that Mother Nature, or the rest of nature, offers us, and trying to accommodate that. That's what economics is about. The rest is all, details. If you're interested in the market, which is that for historical reasons, that became the object of interest in economics. I think it's a feature of the times. It was not intrinsic to the subject. You can't avoid economics. Everybody does economics. The farmer does economics, the fisherman does economics, the forester does economics, the aborigine in the hills of Assam does economics, because without that, he has to ask, today, tomorrow versus tomorrow, mine versus my neighbors, and so forth. So these are problems that are universal. How they're resolved is, of course, not universal. That takes wide varieties. But these issues can't be avoided, and economics is really about these issues and how to classify them and see how they're resolved into various societies in different times. We tend to teach only the market, but that's because it's the easy one. It has nothing to do with the intrinsic importance, because even in the most market-oriented society, most of transactions, at least in terms of volume, are undertaken outside the market. Just peer inside the household. You see incredible amount of exchanges taking place without any comment as exchange. You don't sort of say, it's only when you get irritated you say, well, I did the washing up yesterday. You want me to do it today? You don't do that, actually. It's an implicit way of orchestrating all that. So economics enters everywhere, and I think it's, what I would say is that we need to adapt economics to the needs. And I think what you're complaining about is exactly right. But it's because of historical conditioning. It's not in the nature of economics per se. It can be adopted.
Mm-hmm. You have to push it.
Yes. Sometimes somebody else pushes it. What you were talking about during your lecture and is the regenerative capacity of Earth. And so if we want to stay within the regenerative capacity of Earth, we need to change the way we look at economics, because then the role of the economy is to provide a good life for all within planetary boundaries. So within this regenerative capacity. And once we understand that, we realize that it's a political question and it's a question of distribution. Whose good life is it? What does it mean that we want to provide it for all? And how can we all, as human species, stay within these planetary boundaries and within the regenerative capacity? So, so I think it is a highly political issue, and I really wonder how you feel we can tackle. You did mention the top 1%, and that we need to address that issue, and I absolutely understand. But is this inclusive wealth? Is the inclusivity of that wealth implies also not just the inclusivity of natural capital into the overall capital stock, but also the inclusivity of human inclusivity?
Yeah, that's sorry. Yes, I have not lost connection with human well-being, although I think one of the things that I was trying to emphasize earlier on is that we may be being too narrow-minded in limiting ourselves to human well-being, that we ought to be thinking about the sustenance and well-being of other creatures on Earth. But let's take your point. When I'm talking about the regeneration rate, it's in some sense a minimal condition you require in order to be able to survive sustainably. Nature is, we are embedded in nature, and if that we let go of that, we're really in trouble. And we're in trouble when the demand we make on nature. When I say nature now, again, you have to think, if you think globally, you can talk about the biosphere. If you're talking about the neighborhood, very locally, you can talk about the local environment. Okay, so the scale is not, I'm ignoring the scale problem. I'm just literally saying, when I say we, then you can decide whether it's your community or your nation or the world as a whole, doesn't matter. The same, in some sense, the same argument arises. Politics enters everywhere. Politics enters even in the neighborhood, never mind the global economy. So in a way, that's not the feature which distinguishes what I'm talking about. How it's resolved, of course, depends on the scale. The minimal condition for sustainable development, if you like, you work backwards. You ask, what do I mean by sustainable development? I think one way of thinking about it is to ask whether, in some sense, human well-being, now and projection into the future, is expanding over time. If it does, then that's a good thing in some sense. Otherwise, you're jeopardized. If that's not the case, then you're taking more now to fill your own well-being and jeopardizing it. So you can define sustainable development through human well-being as the input, as the object of interest. Not nature, just human well-being. Let's suppose you do that, just for the sake of argument. Suppose you do that. You can then ask what are the necessary conditions for that to happen. And one necessary condition, the key necessary condition, is that the stocks that affect future potentials, our well-being and our future ones, do not decline in the aggregate. And some might increase in some. So that theorem is the one which I mentioned in the notes when I said there was one theorem which is inclusive wealth and human. That's all I mean. That's the stocks of natural capital, of all forms of capital. And the reason for that, and that includes, by the way, our emotional well-being and so forth. So that includes human well-being, human capital as well, not just. Now, if you could, of course, for practical purposes, very often we concentrate, and in this room we're concentrating on the natural capital component because it's an essential ingredient into the other forms, human capital and produced capital. That's the background, if you like. So that's why we're concentrating on that, not for any other reason. So that's what I have in mind when we are talking about sustainable development, because you're carrying the stocks so that you're not depleting the stocks. Or some maybe you are, but on some aggregate notion that you're carrying. That was the Brundtland notion. She didn't quite put it that way, but the Brundtland Commission report, Sustainable, was about handing over to the next generation the productive base that you had inherited from the past. And I think that she got it exactly right. That was no question about it. She didn't have the tools to finesse it the way I managed to do here and in my writings, but that's the idea, that you carry the wherewithal. So it's like leaving for your children a better possibilities than you yourself had inherited, that kind of idea. And what does that mean? How does it translate into stocks of capital? That's the idea here. Now, in other words, what means do you leave behind for human flourishing to not decline? That's the idea. And of course, politics is involved, goes without saying.
Yeah, maybe I just intervene there for a second. So Brundtland, of course, had a point about the need for alternative measures of progress. That actually was kind of a takeoff point for many of the initiatives. And while one could argue that it would be important to have, let's say, a global convention which, as you said, there is at the moment certainly there's been no political appetite for anything like that. But after Brundtland, what it actually provoked was really many different types of experiments, as you know, about what we should measure and how we should measure. And some of them were going in the direction of the SIA framework and comprehensive wealth and inclusive wealth and this type of initiatives. But at the same time, there was also a lot of alternatives that were working with individual indicators, systems, or developed entirely different indices. And either overall or just partial. So I guess that raises a question whether that's a good thing, let 1,000 flowers bloom, or whether we should start converging around some consensus, or at least in some domains of public policy, whether we should be converging, and then besides that, let the experiments happen. And one footnote to this is that, and I'm referring back again to Dana Meadows, there was a report on indicator systems for information and indicator systems for sustainable development that I'm sure you know. And in that one, Dana referred to the importance of process, of people engaging in the process of defining their own metrics and measures, and how empowering that is. Now, if we simply just, and I guess where I'm going with that is making an argument for a broad and sort of heterogeneous set of approaches, because I think this point of engaging people in defining what matters to them and what they want to reflect in their measurement of progress itself is a very powerful experience. So how do we square that? If you know what I mean.
Well, if you're pointing to me, well, you might want to have to go at it as
Alex
well.
Might have, yeah, it's also linked to Alex's points. Yeah.
I think these are very deep questions, and there's no clear answer in the sense of it, one answer. There are many answers. Yeah. So let's give some examples of what I have in mind. So you have an indigenous population in the Amazon, let's say, just for the sake of argument, could be, and you could then start from that extreme to populations which are indigenous in forest areas or in wetlands, who do some trading with the rest of the world, but on the other hand, they are fairly self-contained. I've seen such communities in Zanzibar, for example, who live essentially outside the market system. Occasionally they go into the market system when they need to buy a shirt or something, and then they bring fish and do a bit of exchange and come back. So you have that kind of engagement with nature. Now, there the language they often use, and I have spoken with such people actually through translators. I'd spent some weeks actually in Zanzibar, as it happens, or a couple of weeks. And there, it's a matter of interpretation. An outsider might say, well, actually, there is a real, very often expressed in language, which shows that these objects are ends of life. Say this is a sacred grove, or this is sacred to us, or this activity is. And then you ask, it's a reasonable thing, and it's not an original idea, anthropologists have done it in the past, is to ask whether there is actually an instrumental value to making it into a sacred grove. And somebody who's come from the eastern side of the world, as it were, I have some experience of it, in the sense that there are certain plants in my culture which are sacred. But it turns out that those plants have pharmaceutical benefits, which were realized, long before modern science was developed to see. Hit and trial, certain leaves, oils from the leaves are beneficial to healing processes, injuries and so forth, turns out. And if there is a coincidence between use value and sacredness, you then start wondering whether one is evolved to have a viewpoint which serves an incredibly important purpose. You then don't do transactions when it comes to making use of them. You don't say, now let's look at some trade-offs. When if it's sacred, period. Don't touch it. Now we do that in all societies. There are certain things we don't do. You're trained not to do, because if you start doing that, it will be hell. Every now and then, should I do this? The calculations. No, there are some injunctions, some constraints that are leveled to us, and we accept them because our parents told us to accept them, and it was right to do so. It saves on calculation costs, quite apart from the fact that it also saves from chaos, because people might be doing the calculations differently. And then there will be some serious difficulties. So society does, at least the way I read economics, I look at all these things through the lens of an economist and see whether there is a deeper underlying reason for what we think are ways of doing things. And I think that's a very good way society has resolved these problems. And society wasn't, much cleverer than any of us in this room. Societies have evolved over centuries, and they've devised things by hit and miss. And many of them were misses, by the way. That's why they disappeared. Those societies disappeared. It's not, the Mayas disappeared. And there's a strong ecological reason, at least as we understand it now, as to why they disappeared. They overused their water system was really shrinking, and they mismanaged that. Maybe they had no choice, but anyway, that's what happened. So I think that's how I see these matters, that sometimes we use these words, these sacredness and so forth, which has an instrumental value, but it's good that we put it the way we do, because it safeguards us against mishaps and misuses. I don't know if that makes sense. That's how I think it's less of a mystery to me than to many people as to why we have sacred groves and so forth.
But those are extremely contextual issues. So that almost suggests, there are certain things that you can capture at the macro level, but then there is really a need for, I don't know whether I would even call it an accounting system. You can call it in a holistic sense, that has this ability to differentiate and that has an ability to. I think you're right. Let's try and sum this part of the discussion up, if I can, which is that I think you're absolutely right. I think we're too much into the World Bank view of let's put a measure on everything and then sell it because. Yep. And maybe an alternative is something that very often psychologists do, which is actually to go from community to community and try and ask, how do they feel about life? Have things improved? Have they deteriorated? That'll be qualitative answers, but qualitative answers are probably what we should be happy with rather than trying. But of course, applied psychologists have put numbers in, how happy are you from a scale of 0 to 10? 9? And so forth. And then they add up these numbers and saying, well, the happiness index. And they're not being done by ignorant World Bank officials. They're being done by social psychologists, very famous ones. I think it's misplaced concreteness, but that's my personal view. Yeah, that's good.
But that's my personal view. It's nothing, I can't, it's probably qualitative is about as far as we can go.
Yeah, Alex, just...
Yes, I'm glad you brought in this sacred... I'm glad you brought in this notion of sacredness, because I think among the Sustainable Development Goals there is a Trojan horse.
Sorry?
There's a Trojan horse, and the Trojan horse is growth, economic growth. And when we look at current politics, it seems to me that the only sacred thing is economic growth. We can't give it up, we don't want to give it up, we've built everything on it so that if we don't have it, we're actually, we have serious social and also ecological problems. So, but at the same time, when we're pushing for growth, we seem to be losing what you're talking about, trying to look after nature. So, and this is happening in the European Union. You can see this happening the very moment that we are actually giving up on everything that had been achieved before in terms of sustainability or social standing on the altar of economic growth and what they now call competitiveness. So, and I have the feeling that when we're trying to measure all the time things, then that's also a question. Like when we talk about wealth, then it's very, very easy to talk about growth because the two notions seem to be stuck together in our heads. And I think it would be important to like maybe stop these notions of wealth and growth and try and focus on something else. I think we have a shared acquaintance, Tim Jackson, who just published a book called The Care Economy. And what he says is that we should forget wealth and start using the word health and start focusing on that rather than wealth. Exactly for the reason that we somehow need to get out of this idea of continuous economic growth.
Right. I think everything you've said, I agree with absolutely all of it. And I'm going to put it in a slightly different language and try and reconcile how we can use traditional economic language to be consistent with what you're desiring. So when we talk about economic growth, of course we're talking about GDP growth. That's the implicit thing. See how powerful the notion of GDP is. We don't even have to talk about it, to say it. We just say economic, and that translates into GDP. Now, the reason it's going to stay with us, unfortunately, is that GDP has an incredible seductive feature in competition across economies. GDP means income at hand, cash in hand. You think of households. Cash in hand buys you a lot. If nothing else, influence. A country can influence others by having more cash in hand. They can affect the terms of trade to its own advantage. They can do things, build skyscrapers and so forth and dazzle everybody. They do that. It may be at the cost of natural capital, maybe at the cost of many other things, but at least visibly they're getting ahead. Now, if you have a competition of a Veblen kind, it's competitive. I want to do better than the other. Then this is the index which is going to work best for you. So GDP competition is going to be there. We don't want it because very many often, here's the kind of example you have in mind. My motivation is to be better off than you. Your motivation is to be better off than me. So there is now a prisoner's dilemma game, where each is competing against the other. Because what matters is relative spacing, not absolute. And of course, that's what you're worried about. The fact is the absolute doesn't matter, it's the relative that matters, and therefore we'd be racing each other, but our well-being is not going to differ. It's not going to change because we're running faster, but not relative to each other. That's the problem. And I think there's a great deal of truth in that. It has been much researched upon by sociologists, of course, as you know, that Veblen's work was that. But I want to just finish, I have no solution to it. GDP is going to be there, whether we like it or not, because there is innate competition across communities, and we have to somehow temper it And that's what we're discussing, how to temper it. Having said that, there is another side to human nature, and maybe education is the thing which can influence, which is more the conformist side of nature. And we don't exploit it very much. We think it's natural. But that seems to me to be possible way out of our dilemmas that we are discussing here if we emphasize more of it. The conformist one is that you want to, you have a peer group. Now, that peer group is not given exogenously, but let's suppose, just for the sake of argument, we have a peer group. You don't want to be too far away from the peer average, because if you're too far ahead, bad, you're out, good, you're again distinguished. And you think about, a middle-class life that we have. We give a dinner party, let's just for the sake of argument, for our friends. Do you show off? No, you don't show off. You serve wine of the kind that is expected of you to serve, as it were. We keep some balance of what is expected we keep within our neighborhood, so to speak. This neighborhood effect, I think we don't quite appreciate as much as we should. We do that everywhere in the choice of clothing. See how homogeneous our clothing patterns are. Men wearing a certain type, women wearing a certain type. And of course, variations, within that you want to distinguish a bit. I wear snazzy ties compared to yours, very boring, and so forth. But you know what I mean. We're still wearing ties, all right? So I think one of the things is to emphasize the commonality of our activities. Mm-hmm. We don't do that. We tend to emphasize the competitive part. And I think the community is a very important one, and we don't see that in economics textbooks. You don't see socially embedded preferences. Preferences in the economics textbooks are all individualistic. You come out of nowhere, have a set of preferences, and they don't depend on, they may say, yes, you have other people's activities entering into your preferences. That's what we are discussing just now. But you take that for fixed. But you can't take that for fixed if you're looking at the economy as a whole, because each is affecting the other, and therefore what I see around me is endogenous to the process. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what you're hinting at. It's not something that cannot be modeled. I have done it myself, and others have done it too. Mm-hmm. It's just that it's very hard to persuade econometricians to do some estimation based on it. I have not been able to persuade any of them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think we are getting close to our allocated time. I'm just going to raise one last point. As I think you also know, at IISD we've done a fair bit of work on, the term we use is comprehensive wealth accounting, which is using very similar, working with the World Bank, using very much the terminologies that you are using. It is in the camp that Alex is raising. It's trying to sort of re-engineer the system from within. I'm fully aware of that. And we've done some national pilots in Canada, Trinidad, Indonesia, and Ethiopia. So, and I'm just interested in the one hand, the future of the work that you've done is going down to the national level, the sectoral level, doing pilots, trying to understand the feasibility of doing this type of calculations and at lower levels. Is that a good next step? In our view, it can be done. In these pilots, we found this, by and large, can be done. You can learn things from these exercises that you are not getting from GDP accounts that are potentially useful. And then, where does that leave us with respect to this critique that you're still just trying to engineer a system from within that has more fundamental problems. So maybe we also have to give room to alternative approaches. The problem I see is that over the last decades, many of these have been tried. I mean, we've spent years developing a Canadian index of well-being. Australia has done the same thing. There have been lots of these nationalized. The problem is that if they are done outside of the frame of the mainstream, these things tend to die, or they become standalone academic exercises, and the CIW has kind of disappeared, got relegated to a university department, and nothing happened, no uptake. But the media gets fascinated with it for a few weeks or a few months, and then that's it. And that's, we've been kind of somehow in that loop, I think now for decades. And that's why I think somehow we are still stuck with this. I mean, to me, the most sort of epitome of that was when the European Commission around 2008 or 9 organized the Beyond GDP conference, and we're listening to Barroso, you know, make statements about how important it is and so on. And in the next meeting, they are talking about economic growth.
Yeah.
As if, you know, I mean, there was any consistency between the two propositions. So. Yeah, I mean, that's also a sense of frustration, but right?
I know.
So
Absolutely.
Maybe just some closing thoughts from you, and then I think
No,
we
I
do need to. Yeah.
I really don't have any closing remarks to make, except that I've really enjoyed these discussions, because these are issues that are of profound importance, but they don't get much discussed in professional circles. Yes, we have to break out of the GDP thing, but it's going to be there. So the idea is not to sort of just trash it, but to create a parallel set of, persuade national accountants to produce a parallel set of accounts. Accounts have to be produced, no question about it. That's the way politicians communicate with the public, and how the public's responses get assimilated by decision makers. And I think if we can persuade our national accountants to produce things that matter. For example, there are other kinds of statistics which are not, national accountants don't produce. Are there, but they're in the literature. People do say, you know, how are you feeling? Do you feel that the world is better now than it was when when you were 10 and so forth? There are data on that, plenty. There is Gallup does that kind of exercise all the time, but they're relegated into newspaper articles periodically when they publish their thing. They're not absorbed by our national accountants. And I think those kinds of data should be published all the time. And then, of course, that gives statisticians a lot of job to do. What they do is to try and correlate from the answers people give to GDP. And see whether there is a connection, and say, what's the surest route to human happiness, kind of thing. But that's inevitable. But I think there are data out there. People respond to questionnaires, and it would. I've often felt surprised that they're not made use of by national accountants.
Okay, thank you. I guess on our behalf, we really thank you for your contribution. I think I'm going to give back the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for keeping the time, because we have a little of a time pressure. Thank you. And we still have time for a few questions, and you can ask any member of the panel, so please feel free to formulate your questions, and I will hand over the microphone, should you have one, before we go to have lunch.
Thank you. Ildiko Jackson from the Fiscal Council. And my question goes to Sir Dasgupta. Actually, questions. The first one, you mentioned this analogy of the pond. And as I understand, this is the global economy, right? But when we try to look at this from the practical point of view, we come to this top-down and bottom-up approach to actually making it live. You've mentioned quite a few problems or issues with the top-down measurements and how to introduce this and how to manage this in the world. So the question comes, how we can do this top-down, well, bottom-up. There we have an issue as well, and I wonder if you have a view from the economics point of view, like how you can look at these interrelated little fish ponds that naturally influenced by the global economy and the globalization. So whether at all it was possible to measure a certain pond, let's say a national economy, by this method. And that brought me actually on whether, my thinking, if a nation state or even a region was the right ground of measurement. Because obviously, as you started your talk today, when we talk about investments, you think about stocks, right? Our life and this whole growth culture is very much influenced by the business elite and the stock exchange. So is there a way to introduce a way of measurement of the individual performance of companies that influences in turn the stock exchange measures, and that would force eventually such thinking? And that again, what influences the companies to go on? Obviously the individual and the personal preferences that you just talked about. Now, in terms of the preferences, there's, I think, at least in this part of the world, a good measure of development in terms of being more aware of biodiversity and the issues of sustainability. And how the third question is how you see the relevance of the individual on companies and in return, and whether this whole revolution could start from the individual rather than expecting any higher up institutions or governments to take steps. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for asking this. It's something I have given some thought to, and I haven't progressed very much because these are context-dependent answers depending on what the... well, let's consider a concrete example of shrimp farming, shrimp farms. They're useful because shrimp farms have significant externalities across farms because the use of antibiotics. The antibiotics flow into neighboring farms, affecting their productivity. Now, so these are externalities, negative externalities that take place. And if you use that as just a metaphor, then what we're looking at is companies making decisions, investment decisions, targeting a particular resource base because the chain, the value chain, is from source, supply source, up to where they're selling the commodity in the market, the final commodity in the market. They're interlinked. Now, the nice thing about this example, however, from our perspective, social analyst perspective, is that each of the companies they may be competing in the product market, but they have an innate interest in cooperating in the factor market, because each of the value chains are connected to each other, and excessive extraction by one is going to affect the other one adversely, and vice versa. The shrimp farm is just a very extreme example of it, but there are many other things that you can think of. And this is something that I think needs to be understood, that companies which are competing in the product market may wish to, or should cooperate there. That requires, how do you get that to happen? One way of doing that would be actually to make disclosure a compulsory, disclosure along the entire supply chain a compulsory fact. Now, in some sense, we are used to disclosure. We now, at least in the West, we insist when we buy something, a food product, there's a whole long list of things that we want answers for before we buy it. So there is disclosure. We are not unused to that idea. I'm just carrying that argument here, this idea, to entire supply chains. This is one case where, in fact, the companies themselves would, in principle, these particular examples where they're interacting adversely, would have an incentive to comply with the demand for disclosure, because disclosure is a substitute for missing markets. You see, the problem is arising because their markets are missing, and that's why the coordination problem that markets usually provide is not being supplied. And So you need some form of cooperation. There are plenty of such examples. The key thing is that we forget the extensive existence of externalities. Externalities, by the way, it's simply consequences that take place of one's actions which are not negotiated with others. Consequence to others, which in the absence of negotiation, so that they're not unaccounted for consequences, if you like. And I think that's one thing we ought to get used to, that in the presence of such externalities, we need to think about how best to. The market is not going to solve it. Sometimes they do, but not. In some sense, you might say the whole market mechanism is designed to eliminate externalities. The economic theorists would take that view. We're looking at the cases where it can't do that or hasn't done it. And therefore that you might need some political solution, bargaining across agencies and so forth, to facilitate aid. And I think that's that's the direction I would move in thinking about the questions that you've raised.
I'm Sister Laura. Laura Bar is teaching human-centered economics, which is pretty close to nature-centered economics in different universities. And my question would be that you were talking about the connection between means and ends, the influence of stock on the human flourishing. And to take it simple, that if the stock increases, the human flourishing would increase, but it's not so simple, because there can be an over-increase, an over-consumption, too much, too big. So we need limit on the growth of the stocks, moral limits, in my opinion, a limit of frugality, a limit of justice, a limit of cleverness. And these are moral values, and you were speaking about spiritual values, which are pretty close to each other, moral and spirituality. My question would be that where is the place of these values in your model, in your holistic model? How would you measure, how would you imply these point of views? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Beautiful question and very hard one to answer, but in practical sense. But when we talk about wealth, and inclusive wealth, for example, that I've been using the term, it's not just the stocks, but there's a weight given to each of the stocks, and they're called prices. In this case, we're not looking at market prices. We call them shadow prices or accounting prices. Which reflect social values. So an accounting price or a shadow price of a stock is formally speaking, it's the increase in expected or forecast well-being across the generations if you had one more unit of that stock. Okay, so if it has negative consequences, it means the stock is actually deleterious. If it's positive, in any case, the idea is the price may be different from the market price. And I think that's where the answer the way to address your question is that stocks might increase, but their accounting prices might decline as a consequence of their increasing. The way you're describing a process by which. And if that happens, then the wealth actually declines even though the stocks are increasing. It's the value of the stocks, which I have not, but the value of a stock is the price of the social price of the stock, social price or accounting price, multiplied by the stock itself, okay, of a building, let's say, or a piece of machinery, or whatever. And the stock itself, in physical units, in its own units, might increase. But if the value declines, then its increase doesn't necessarily mean an increase in the value of that stock. Could be just the reverse. And I think what you have in mind is a very good example of a case where, in fact, the growth of the stocks might lead to a decline in the value of those stocks to the extent that inclusive wealth declines, and therefore, given the theorem, well-being declines. I don't know if that makes sense, but believe me, technically what I've said is correct. That I know, because it's a mathematical formulation. Mm-hmm. And it's very important because it's telling us that you could have rises in stocks, accumulation, and yet well-being going down, which is the case that you have in mind. It's not inconsistent because the value of those stocks is declining because they're getting in each other's way. Let's give one simple example. Just imagine a case where households are competing against each other. You know, if you go to Italy and you have these towns with half-finished high-rises, if you like, towers, because the households were competing against one another, and they ran out of money, and so it stays put, another one climbs up. So that's completely wasteful competition. Stocks are going up. Size of the buildings are the height of the thing, if you like. But the competition is eroding the value of those, is leading to, you know, climbing, but you're not happier, because what matters is the height of your tower relative to the others. So you could have a doubling of everything, but no better in terms of valuation. I'm using an extreme example to show how I think I can redo the language to accommodate your worry, which is extremely important. Of course, it's extremely important. A wasteful competition. The Veblen effect. Everybody spends more. It's like running a race, you know, you're against an escalator which is going behind you, as it were, you're not stepping ahead. Does that make sense to you? Do you see, it's not, the language I've been trying to use, accounting prices, they do accommodate that kind of difficulties in principle. And in practice too, that's what we see. That you're all growing wealthier, but you're not going happier. If all you care about is your position relative to the other. We know in advance it's going to be a losing proposition entering the race. Now, the only way you can stop that from happening is having a collective agreement not to enter the race. One way you do that may be exercise this force of the state. I don't know, some kind of. But you know in advance it's going to be a wasteful competition, leading to nothing but waste of resources. And the other possibility would be, of course, since I'm speaking to you, would be for the church to enter and say, don't do it. It's not going to be moral guidance. What's wrong with that?
Maybe can I just interject for one thing? I think an extreme example would be competition that results in conflict, and the capital investment, I mean, which we are seeing in weaponry as a stock. I mean, what are the implications for well-being overall? I think there are, again, the moral issues and so on are quite significant. Yeah. I think we need to finish.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that we could continue this conversation and question and answers for another couple of hours, but unfortunately for the time of the conference is up, so I have to close it for the time. And we are going to continue tomorrow at the MTA, the Academy of Sciences. So whoever has the time, you are more than welcome to join us tomorrow as well, and then you can continue listening to the professor and asking other questions. So thank you very much for joining us for today, being here in person, and those of you who joined us online, thank you very much as well for being with us. Those who are here, you are welcome to join us for the lunch, which is served here outside of the room. And I would like to ask everybody who hasn't signed the sheet yet, please do so at the exit of the room. So thank you very much again. Thank you for being here with us and making this conversation be possible. And hope to welcome you at our next meeting again. Thank you.